Hey, level casters. Today's lesson takes us back in time to a very important and difficult period in history, the Great Depression. Imagine a time when many people lost their jobs, their homes, and even their hope. This wasn't just a small problem, it affected almost everyone, everywhere, for a long time. It was a global economic crisis that started in the United States in 1929 and lasted for about 10 years, until the late 1930s. Before the Great Depression, the 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, was a time of great prosperity and excitement, especially in America. People felt rich, new technologies like radios and cars were common, and the stock market, where people buy and sell parts of companies, was going up and up. Many average people, not just wealthy investors, were putting their savings into stocks, hoping to get rich quickly. They often bought stocks on margin, which means they only paid a small part of the price and borrowed the rest. This was very risky, but at the time, it seemed like a sure way to make money. People believed the good times would never end. There was a lot of optimism, and everyone wanted to be a part of this new era of wealth. Factories were producing many goods, and people were buying them. It seemed like the economy was strong and growing every day. However, beneath this shiny surface, some serious problems were developing. Production of goods was starting to outpace demand, meaning factories were making more things than people could actually buy. Farmers were also having a tough time, even during the Roaring Twenties, as prices for their crops were falling. And, as we mentioned, buying stocks on borrowed money was a ticking time bomb. This period of widespread economic confidence, fueled by easy credit and speculative investments, created a bubble that was destined to burst, bringing an end to the Roaring Twenties, and ushering in a decade of hardship and transformation. The good times came to a sudden, shocking end on October 24, 1929, a day famously known as Black Thursday. On this day, the stock market in New York City crashed. People suddenly started to sell their stocks very quickly, causing prices to fall dramatically. This was because investors became nervous about the high prices and started to lose confidence. The selling continued, and the worst day was Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, when millions of shares were traded, and the market lost even more value. Many people who had invested all their savings, or even borrowed money to buy stocks, lost everything. Imagine waking up one day to find all your money gone. This stock market crash was not the only cause of the Great Depression, but it was a very big signal that something was seriously wrong with the economy. After the crash, banks started to fail. Why? Because banks had also invested in the stock market, and they had lent money to people who could no longer pay it back. When people heard that banks were in trouble, they rushed to withdraw their money, a phenomenon called a bank run. But banks didn't keep all the money in their vaults, they invested it. So, when too many people tried to take out their money at once, the banks ran out of cash and had to close their doors. This meant that many ordinary people lost all their savings, as there was no insurance for bank deposits back then. With banks failing, businesses couldn't get loans, and people didn't have money to spend. This led to factories closing, and millions of people losing their jobs. Unemployment rose to incredibly high levels, reaching about 25% in the United States. That means 1 out of every 4 people who wanted to work couldn't find a job. This was a domino effect. The stock market crashed, banks failed, businesses closed, and people lost their jobs and savings. It was a downward spiral that seemed impossible to stop. Life during the Great Depression was incredibly difficult for most people. With so many out of work, families struggled to put food on the table. Many lost their homes because they couldn't pay their rent or mortgage. They had to live in makeshift shantytowns, which were groups of small, crude shelters built from scrap materials like cardboard and tin. These shantytowns were often called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the crisis. People stood in long lines for free food, often called soup kitchens, or waited for bread from bread lines. Children often went hungry, and many had to drop out of school to try and find work, even if it was just selling apples on the street. The psychological impact was also huge. People felt hopeless and humiliated. Men, who were traditionally the main providers for their families, felt like failures if they couldn't find work. This led to a lot of stress and sadness within families. On top of these economic problems, some parts of the United States, especially the Midwest, faced an environmental disaster known as the Dust Bowl. Years of drought and poor farming practices turned fertile land into dry, dusty plains. Huge dust storms, sometimes called black blizzards, swept across the region, destroying crops, killing livestock, and making it impossible to breathe. Thousands of families, often called Okies, because many came from Oklahoma, were forced to leave their homes and migrate west, especially to California, looking for work and a better life. They faced even more hardship, often being treated poorly and finding little opportunity. The government, under President Hoover, initially believed the economy would fix itself. However, as the crisis deepened, it became clear that more direct action was needed. This period truly tested the resilience of the American people and forced a rethinking of the government's role in the economy and in people's lives. When Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, he promised a New Deal for the American people. This was a series of government programs designed to bring relief, recovery, and reform. Relief meant helping people immediately, like providing food and jobs. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, hired young men to work on environmental projects, like building parks and planting trees. Recovery aimed to get the economy working again. The Public Works Administration, PWA, built large infrastructure projects like dams and bridges, creating many jobs. Reform was about changing the system to prevent another depression. One very important reform was the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which still exists today. The FDIC insures bank deposits, so if a bank fails, people don't lose their savings. This restored people's trust in banks. Another key reform was Social Security, which provides financial support for retired people, the unemployed, and those with disabilities. These programs were revolutionary because they greatly expanded the role of the government in the economy and in people's lives. While the New Deal didn't completely end the Great Depression, full recovery only came with the massive spending and job creation associated with World War II. It certainly eased the suffering and laid the groundwork for a more stable economy. The Great Depression taught the world important lessons about economic regulation, the need for a social safety net, and the interconnectedness of global economies. It fundamentally changed how governments approached economic crises and how societies viewed their responsibility to their citizens. It was a period of immense hardship, but also one that led to significant social and economic changes that still impact us today.
That was a really interesting story.
Yes, the Great Depression sounds like a terrible time.
I can't imagine losing all my money.
Me neither. The stock market crash was huge.
And then the banks failed?
So many people lost their jobs.
They called those poor areas Hoovervilles.
That was sad. People living in shacks.
And the Dust Bowl made it worse.
Yes, farmers had no crops.
President Roosevelt started the New Deal.
That helped a lot, right?
Yes, it created jobs and hope.
The FDI sounds very important.
It protects our money in banks now.
And Social Security helps older people.
The government learned from the crisis.
It showed how connected everything is.
We still feel its effects today.
It was a huge turning point.
That was a great lesson. Keep learning, Levelcasters.